Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Farm Advisory Service webinar on Spring Barley, Planning Your NPK. My name is Chris McDonald. I'm an agricultural consultant based in the Lothians and the Borders, and I will be chairing this webinar today. This is the first of two webinars we will be holding this year on nutrient management. The purpose of today really is to focus on the NP requirements for spring barley. So our speakers today include Professor Ian Bingham. Ian's a senior researcher in the crops and soils team within SRUC. And Ian has been working on an AHDB project looking at nitrogen recommendations in spring barley, which has included trial work in East Lothian. We also have Dr. Bill Crooks. Bill is a senior consultant in SAC and soil scientist, and Bill works with Alex Sinclair and others on the fertilizer technical notes. Finally, I will cover nutrient management guidance in spring barley. We're also very grateful to my colleague Craig Bothwell, who's providing technical support and will be available for questions as well. So I'd now like to pass on to Ian Bingham, who's going to talk about reviewing nitrogen fertilizer recommendations for spring barley. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just get my screen shared. There we go. I hope everybody can see that. Yes, and good afternoon, everybody. What I'd like to do is present an outline of an AHDB project we've been working on. And that's been gathering evidence for a review of the N fertilizer recommendations for spring barley. And really the purpose of the review is to inform the next revision of the nutrient management guidelines, RB 209. Now, what I hope this will do is give you a flavor for the type of information that goes into the fertilizer recommendations. Sorry, let's see if we can click on. There we go. Sorry, this wasn't scrolling through. The project is started in 2018 and it's run for 3 years. So we are approaching the end of it now. It's due to finish this year. And we've got a couple of months yet to go. We'll report at the end of April. So we're in the process of gathering the final pieces of information together and doing the final data analysis. Now, ADAS are the leads on the project, and we are scientific partners with them. We also have a number of industry partners shown here. A logo not on here, unfortunately, is SWRI, Scotch Whisky Research Institute. That they're also collaborating on the project. And we have collaborations from Chagas in Ireland and also Segas in Denmark, and I'll explain the role of those organizations in the next slide. The rationale for the project really is because the industry is constantly changing. We're seeing yields on farm increasing, as you can see here in this graph, a steady increase in yield of spring barley. We also have more growers, particularly south of the border now, looking to spring barley as a method to try and get on top of their blackgrass, and also as an alternative to oilseed rape, where they're facing problems with flea beetle. And with spring barley, of course, we have different markets and different grain nitrogen specifications. So it's quite a difficult crop to grow from that point of view, if you're aiming for particular sort of markets. So with all that in mind, then I think it's prudent for us to, on a fairly regular basis, review the fertilizer recommendations to make sure that they are still suitable, whether they're going to meet the needs of growers. Now, before we look at the results, I thought it'd be useful just to outline what goes into making a fertilizer recommendation. This graph shows a typical nitrogen response curve. So if you grow a crop without any fertilizer at all, it will still grow to some extent, it will still yield. But in general, the nitrogen that's supplied by the soil isn't enough to meet the full demands of the crop. So when you apply fertilizer, you see a steady increase in the yield of the crop until you reach a point when the nitrogen demands are met. And at this point, we have the nitrogen optimum, or what we call the N-opt, and this is effectively the rate of nitrogen at which any further increase in yield doesn't cover the cost of the additional fertilizer that you apply. Now, that fertilizer requirement can vary from site to site, and it's basically the demand of the crop minus what can be supplied by the soil, or the soil nitrogen supply. So that variation in fertilizer requirement is because both the demand of the crop can vary from site to site, and also what the soil can supply varies. And we try and estimate the crop demand by estimating what our expected yield is likely to be. And we try and estimate what is being supplied by the soil using various methods, but the soil index based on previous cropping and on what the residue might be from that previous crop, and soil type come into play there. But these are notoriously difficult things to predict with any kind of degree of accuracy. So once that nitrogen, the optimum nitrogen rate has been sort of decided or defined, then the next stage is to reduce that nitrogen recommendation below that, bring that nitrogen recommendation down to account for the grain nitrogen concentration that is your target, because the grain nitrogen concentration, as you can see here, varies in a different way with nitrogen fertilizer to that of yield. So with that in mind, when we were thinking about reviewing the fertilizer recommendations, we set ourselves a number of questions to ask. So we make these are just some of the questions listed here, and we make adjustments to the nitrogen recommendations according to crop demand, and we try and estimate that crop demand based on the expected yield of the crop. But how good is the evidence for that? That's one of the questions we wanted to address. Do crops at high yielding sites have a greater demand, and how robust is that evidence? Another question is, what is the grain nitrogen concentration at the N-opt, and does it need to be adjusted for yield in the same way as N-opt would need to be adjusted? How much does the nitrogen rate need to be reduced to meet our target grain nitrogen concentrations? And do new higher yielding varieties have a greater fertilizer requirement than the older ones? And if so, then how do we treat those different varieties? Do we need a different way of treating them? And then the final question was about nitrogen timing. So what are the effects of nitrogen timing on yield and grain nitrogen concentration? Now, the approach we've taken to try and address some of these questions is to analyze existing data sets. So we have access to 38 different N-rate experiments and 8 different nitrogen timing experiments between 2005 and 2017, all done in the UK. So that's been the primary basis of a lot of the information that we've got. But we've also, through our collaboration with Segas in Denmark, they've got a huge data set. So they've got over 350 different nitrogen rate experiments conducted over 20 years or so that we've got access to. And in Ireland, Chagas have provided or given us access to data from 30 different nitrogen rate experiments. Now, I mean, all our primary analysis is on the UK data, because those are what we would have to make any kind of recommendation for changes to the fertilizer recommendations. We'd need to base that on UK data. But the value of having the Danish data and the Irish data is just to give us a check to see whether the kind of changes that we're looking at in the UK are also being found in other countries. But the UK data a little bit light in terms of nitrogen timing experiments, and they also didn't contain the most recent varieties. So we were interested in doing some new experiments as well. So we did experiments at 4 sites in over 3 years, just to, I said, primarily to focus on timing, but also to do some nitrogen rate experiments using 3 of the more recent varieties, Planet, Laureate, and Concerto. And these experiments were conducted over, say, 4 sites. 3 of the sites were down in south of the border. So these are ADAS at Terrington, Gleedthorpe, and High Mothorpe. And we had a site in Scotland at East Lothian, run by ourselves at SRUC. So these sites gave us a range of different soil types to work on as well. So if we come back to some of the questions then that we set ourselves, so one of the questions was, do higher yielding crops, have a greater nitrogen demand? We base our adjustments on that, but how good is the evidence? Well, from the data set, and which is shown in blue, the existing data, and also the new experiments, I think we can see a very good relationship between the yield at the optimum and the crop nitrogen demand. So those higher yielding crops, and these are higher yielding because of the sort of site to site variation, have a higher nitrogen demand compared to the lower yielding sites. So I think the adjustments that we make in nitrogen application for yield are justified. We have the data to justify that, and these are down here are the kind of adjustments that are currently recommended. So what's the grain nitrogen at the nitrogen optimum, and does it vary with yield? Well, plotted here is the yield at the N optimum against grain nitrogen, and you can see there's quite a wide range of yields here, all the way from 4 through to 9 tons per hectare across the various trial sites. And broadly speaking, there's no real relationship with grain nitrogen. So grain nitrogen varied from site to site, but not with yield across these different experiments. And the average grain nitrogen in these experiments was 1.72. So I think what this particular analysis shows us is that we don't really need to adjust we don't need to adjust the fertilizer requirement at N optimum specifically for grain nitrogen. So our baseline of 1.72 is what we can then start to make our adjustments for grain nitrogen from. We don't need to adjust that baseline for yield. How much should we reduce the grain nitrogen below that baseline to hit a particular target grain nitrogen concentration? Well, we've tried to answer that by using our various nitrogen response curves from the trials to estimate the average nitrogen rate that hits a particular target grain nitrogen concentration. So you can see from these bars here that you need a lower nitrogen rate to give you a lower nitrogen concentration. That's not unexpected, but the slope of this drop here is what gives us the figure that we can work from. So this shows us that there is a reduction of about 31 kilos of nitrogen per hectare to reduce the grain nitrogen percentage by 0.1%. But again, these things vary. So we're seeing a range depending on the experiment from 17 to 49. But on average, we're looking at something like a 30 kilo reduction for a given for a 0.1 reduction in grain nitrogen. And this is actually already what's covered in the RB 209 recommendations. The recommendation there is for 30 kilos. So do varieties need to be treated differently? So we have higher yielding new varieties like Planet and Laureate, and they are higher yielding than some of the older varieties like Concerto. But we found no evidence that these varieties actually differ in their nitrogen requirement. And this is illustrated here with just one sort of set of response curves. So this is Concerto here in yellow, and the two higher yielding varieties here, Laureate and Planet, above that. So we can see the differences in yield, but the nitrogen requirement, the optimum nitrogen, N-opt, is pretty much the same. Now, that could be because these differences in nitrogen requirement between the varieties may be just too small to detect in these experiments. But we also know from other work that breeding for increased yield has also led to an increase in their nitrogen use efficiency. So this is illustrated here with this with data from experiments we did a few years ago. And what we did was to take old varieties. So these are varieties that were introduced in the 1930s and the 1940s, and also varieties that were much more recent than that. That's sort of the most modern variety was 2005, and we grew them all in the same field at the same time to compare their yield and their nitrogen use. We were able to measure the nitrogen use efficiency as the grain yield divided by their nitrogen supply, and that supply includes both fertilizer and what the soil is supplying. And what you can see, I think, is that the modern varieties here had a higher nitrogen use efficiency than the old varieties. And there's about a 73% increase here between the oldest and the youngest. And this was a 75-year span. So we're looking at about a 1% increase in the nitrogen use efficiency per year. And this, just to be clear, has come not as a direct result for breeding for nitrogen use efficiency, but as a consequence of breeding for higher yield. So when we bred for higher yield, we've also increased the nitrogen use efficiency. And that's partly because the modern varieties actually are able to take up nitrogen more efficiently from fertilizer and from the soil, but also because they utilize the nitrogen that's in the tissues better to produce yield. So if we're moving on now to the nitrogen timing experiments, what we've done here is we've run these experiments over 4 different sites and over 3 years. And at each site, the total nitrogen was selected according to the site and the expected yield. But we use the same timing treatments in each experiment. And this is just an example for the experiments that we did at East Lothian. So our total nitrogen rate in those experiments was 120 kilos. But the 4 nitrogen timing treatments were these. So we put all the nitrogen in the seed bed was one treatment. Another treatment was what we call the RB209, because that's following the recommendation to put 1/3 into the seed bed and 2/3 on during sort of tillering, but prior to the start of stem extension. What we're calling a late treatment was where all the nitrogen was put on at tillering, but before the start of stem extension, and none went into the seed bed. And then we had a little and often treatment where that was split as a 3-way split. So it was applied equally at each of the different timings. I think one thing I just want to highlight to you is that 3 of the treatments all received some nitrogen in the seed bed. It was only the late treatment that didn't have anything in the seed bed. So what effect did this timing have on yield? Well, the late treatment significantly reduced the yield compared to the other treatments. There were no significant differences between any of the other treatments. And that reduction was about 0.4 tons per hectare. But this was an average across all the different sites and years. We only found significant effects in 4 of those 11 site seasons, but they were enough to actually, pulled, in a cross-site analysis to make that a significant reduction. And this is just a shot from a drone that we flew over the plots at East Lothian in 2018. You may recall that this was a particularly dry year, and so the shot was prior to flowering, just prior to flowering, and the end timing experiments were done in this block here. And what I've highlighted with these rings are the plots that are the late treatment. So these plots here within the rings didn't receive any nitrogen in the seedbed, whereas all the other plots received at least some of the nitrogen in the seedbed. And you can see here that the plots didn't establish quite as well, and the crop doesn't look, it looks patchier. And so I think there is a benefit of having some of the nitrogen in the seedbed, particularly in a dry year. These were the nitrogen rate experiments sort of next door, and these particular plots didn't have any nitrogen at all. These were the 0 plots, so it's a useful reference to look at this kind of treatment, the timing treatment. So what effect did those nitrogen timing treatments have on grain N concentration? We didn't find any significant difference at all. When averaged, when we did a cross-site analysis, so there was no significant effect. We did find a significant increase with the late treatment, which corresponds with the lower yield in that treatment, at 3 of 11 sites, but they weren't big enough to make an overall effect in the cross-site analysis, because the scale of the effects ranged from 0.04% to 0.15%. So I think key messages then, and I'd need to emphasize that we are still in the process of actually pulling information together. So these are kind of preliminary messages, if you like. We still need to write the final report. But what's coming through, I think, is that the adjustments to the N rate for yield and grain nitrogen are broadly in line with current recommendations. So the committee that reviews this evidence may wish to make some small changes, but I don't anticipate there will be large changes. We haven't found any evidence that varieties need to be treated differently. Nitrogen rate we found has a larger effect on grain nitrogen concentration than nitrogen timing, and there appears to be a reasonable amount of flexibility in the timing of nitrogen if we're thinking about yield and grain N concentration. We've demonstrated that there are clearly some benefits to having some nitrogen in the seedbed, especially in dry springs. And although we didn't find any effect of the little and often treatment, where we were finding where we were putting 40 kilos of nitrogen or something around that, a third of the nitrogen going on at sort of the flag leaf emergent stage, but we didn't find any overall effect on grain nitrogen in those kind of in those experiments. I think there is still a benefit of putting the timing your nitrogen applications earlier than that, because it will reduce the risk of exceeding grain nitrogen concentrations if you're going for the sort of malt distilling market. So there will be a greater risk, even though we didn't find it in our experiments. Okay, and I would just like to end there just by acknowledging the scientific partners in this. So it's Pete Berry and Sarah Kendall at ADAS, and Steve Hode, a colleague of mine at SRUC, were involved in the project, and again our industry partners. And this time we've got SWRI acknowledged. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. That was very interesting. If anyone, just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please fire away in the question and answer, the Q&A tab, which hopefully you can see. We'll have time, as I say, for questions at the end. I think we'll just move on to Bill Crooks. I see you're there, Bill. So if you want to start your presentation, Bill's going to focus on, particularly on phosphate in spring barley.
Hi there, just trying to getting my computer sorted out here. And display settings. Right. I was asked to cover just two quick points. Again, this is mainly entirely focusing on phosphorus and potassium. And the two things that we talk about today is a new regional approach to how we're providing these recommendations. It's I think an important step for us in terms of recognizing the challenges that local climate and soil type and market pressures can have, and it needs to be reflected in how we provide advisory advice. And the second one that I'll be talking about today is an advance that we made in 2015 in how we provide phosphate recommendations. So we'll provide a bit of background for that and just discuss one of the main implications that came from that. The move towards regional advice that happened just 2 years ago now. It's been we've decided that we need to break the advice that we provide into regions across Scotland. This is going to provide more targeted advice as our knowledge expands. And again, as I said before, will give us the opportunity to take local knowledge, local experience and local pressures. One example that comes to mind is we're seeing a real change now in the soil acidity status across Scotland. So lime price being a real big important factor for that. So someone growing the same crop in one part of Scotland is going to be facing different price pressures, different priorities in terms of cost-effective production than another part of Scotland. So that's just one example. But then, of course, we have climate and we have soil differences as well. So it's more relevant background information as part of that as well. And again, that discussion about acidity management is part of that. We're seeing trends in certain parts of it, and it's important that where the messages that go alongside that about the importance of the balance between good soil conditions as well as fertilizer for crop production. So by breaking it into regions, we can focus on and set more targeted priorities for each area. And that final statement on this slide was the main driver behind it, because we were finding important information, important messages were arising, but we've left them out of our advisory information because we couldn't generalize them for all of Scotland. It couldn't be said for all of Scotland, therefore it couldn't be said. And we'd like to move away from that. So the result of that is these 4 technical notes, for the Highlands and the Islands, a separate one for the southwest of Scotland, the northeast, Scotland and Tayside, and then Fife, Lothian and Scottish borders. So when you're coming to access advisory advice for phosphate and potassium, make sure you're looking at the one that's relevant to your area. They're all available on the FAST website, and they're going to grow. The difference between these 4 publications will change as more information arises, as we get additional information that can drive the separation between the documents and making them more specific to the region that they're targeted for. The second thing I was going to talk about today, and the main point of the discussion, was about the recent change in how we're providing phosphate management advice. It's a much more targeted and informed approach. The work was published in a separate technical note in 2015. I'm not going to cover it in detail today because it is quite a technical and challenging topic in terms of the chemistry that's involved. But if anyone's interested, there's more information in that specific technical note, which is again available from the FAST website. And because that advice has now been cascaded down into all the technical notes that we provide. So the 4 ones that I discussed earlier on now contain this new change, or this new approach to how we're providing phosphate recommendations. This new system takes account of the impact of soil type, and that's the main driver. We've always recognized, we've always known that the same amount of phosphorus applied to one soil type versus another will result in a different response. It's been well understood, but we've never really had the tools to provide different advice based on soil type because of the difficulty in giving that information to farmers. But now with new tools available, particularly map-based GIS systems that anyone can access, and I'll show that later in the talk, you can go and zoom in on your individual field. You can then get some very advanced advice that's very specific to your farm based upon your soil type. And that kind of advice is going to grow because we now have the tools that we can actually provide that advice, whereas before it was hard to do so because you could how do we know what's on your farm? How do we know your soil type? But now we're developing those tools. We have more advanced knowledge, and this is the first example of one of the changes that we're going to see as a result. So again, it's the chemical makeup of your soil that's driving this one, and with the result, or with the impact being just how much phosphorus is available in the year of application for crop production. And this is the main soil CP cycle that drives this particular change. We see here we see the input here, so that would be from your bagged fertilizer or your manures and slurries. All the phosphorus that you apply to your field will go into soil solution, okay, and is available for crop production, which is what we want. Ideally, we would be applying it and it'd be going directly into your crop. But we see here that we recognize that only a small amount of the phosphorus that you apply in the year of production is actually going into that crop. Most of what you're applying is really in a well-managed field, so one where you're conducting regular soil testing and you're keeping your soils on target. You're actually replacing the phosphorus that's going to be taken out that year. Okay, rather than feeding that year's crop, you're really just replacing what that crop's going to take out, because of this time lag, or this lag between application of phosphorus and when it's available for crop, because of this next step. So most of your phosphorus, again, is coming into the system, and most of it's going to go into this sorbed form. So the land or the soil has the ability to grab hold of the phosphorus and hold on to it. It will give it back, but it gives it back over a long period of time. And your soil characteristics are a determining factor into how much of it is given back and how quickly it's given back. And the main variables that are your clay content. So that's a fairly straightforward one that most people can understand. But there's two other important factors, which is the aluminum and the iron oxides that are present in your soils. And that's really tied to the basic fundamental chemistry. So that's where your soils are originated from, what kind of rock they come from, and other weathering processes that have occurred over years. So those are very specific characteristics, and they're not necessarily linked to sand, silt, and clay content. They can be different for two soils that have the same texture, can have very different chemistries. But those three factors are the ones that we've targeted now, and it's only because we have the information now and we have the ability to express this spatially, that, or as a map, that we're able to provide this kind of advice. So again, getting back to this discussion, so the phosphates coming into your system, being sorbed, so being grabbed by the soil itself. Another way of looking at that is I've often had people talk to me about thirsty or hungry land. So a given piece of land that's for some reason doesn't respond as quickly to fertilizer applications as other pieces of land. And this is one of the reasons for that. Okay, it's this underlying basic chemistry. Once it's sorbed in, the soil will give it back. We'll give your phosphorus back through a desorption process. Okay, so it goes back into soil solution, and it's then available for crop uptake. And it's how we manage this process that ensures that we have sufficient amounts of phosphorus availability for your for the crop that you're growing in that year. Okay, and that's why we use soil testing and a recommendation system. So because we're managing this quite complex system. So to achieve this, we classed all of Scotland's soils into three different Scottish sorption capacities. So soil P or PSC capacities. We've limited it to three different classes because we needed to make it a manageable system, something that was practical in terms of applying it. Of course, if it was too complicated, it would be too cumbersome to use. So we've kept it as simple as we can by limiting to three different classes. And in general, the PSC of your soil refers to the differing capacity of the soils to bind with the applied P, making it temporarily unavailable for plant uptake. So again, recognizing or trying to measure the difference between one soil type and another in terms of how much phosphorus it can hold or keep hold of, and how quickly or slowly it will release it back for crop production. So again, just a quick summary of the three classes. So a PSC1 soil requires less fertilizer to be brought up to target. So, but the soil P levels will decline more quickly. So it's much more responsive or dynamic land. Okay, and again, mostly we'll see this characteristic as PS1 in our lighter textured soils or sandy loams and our loamy sands. And like with acidity management, it doesn't require as much input in order to bring it up to target, but this land will go off target or will decline more quickly. In contrast, PS3 soils require a lot more phosphorus, and this is typically characteristic of our heavy textured clay soils. Okay, so they will take a lot more phosphorus to shift from, say, a low status to a moderate status, but once they're on that target, they'll stay up there for a lot longer. So in terms of the total amount of phosphorus that needs to be applied over a 5-year period to get to target is larger, but once these PS3 soils are on target, they'll stay there longer. And then, of course, our PSC2 soils are somewhere in the middle of it. And this is one of the biggest impacts of it. And this is from a table from the technical notes on P&K recommendations for grass, cereals, oilseed, rape, and fodder crops. PS1 and PS2 soils. So if you're bringing a new parcel of land into your business, and you get a soil test done and it comes back as low, you can then look at the tool to determine which type of soil you have, and I'll show you that website in a minute. So a PS1, 2, or 3, and if you're moving from a low to a moderate, okay, then you get your standard fertilizer recommendation, and you'd add 20 kilograms of extra phosphorus for a PS1 soil to move it up to a moderate status. And remember, we're assuming that you're testing your soil every 4 to 5 years. So this additional 20 kilograms per hectare is over the course of that cycle. Okay, so you get your standard recommendation, and then you add extra to bump yourself up to the target. We contrast that with a PS3 soil, which has a slightly different target. I'll cover that in a second. But again, if you want to shift this PSC3 soil up from low to moderate, it takes a little bit more phosphorus, okay, and in this case, double, with PSC2 soils being in the middle of that, okay. The other big factor what big change we made in response to this piece of work was that we changed the target status for PS1 and 2. We dropped it from moderate plus down to moderate minus. Okay, and that's mainly because these soils are demonstrated to be responsive. So if you have a soil test result, so again, if you're bringing a new parcel of land into your business and you have a soil test result that shows you're low, so that immediately you should be recognizing that you're going to have to address that to ensure that over the course of your rotation, you're going to be getting optimum yields for the variety of crops that you have in mind. But because you have responsive or more responsive land than a PS3 soil, we can lower that target because we know you can achieve that within the course of a single rotation. Whereas with PS3 soils, if you want to do the same thing, you need to target a slightly higher status and use more phosphorus. So this is a map of our PSC for the southeast. Those that are farming in this area may be able to recognize or understand this, where a good chunk of the land is PS2, that's a moderate status. But of course, we do have some high PS3 areas here, and patches of low PSC, so PSC1 soils as well. But this particular map isn't that useful if you're trying to identify at the farm level. So I'm going to just see if I can bring up another window to show. This is a website which I've referenced in the drawing, in the presentation, but it's also available in the technical notes. And this is live. So this is online map resource that was created by the Scottish government a couple of years ago. And in this case, we're looking at Oat Ridge here. Okay, so this is a real map. You can zoom right in. We can see the B roads, and we can see some field boundaries. We can see drains. We can see forested areas. And in this instance here, we have a PSC category 3 soil here, and right next to it, a category PS seed soil 1 right next to it. Again, and as we saw in that slide before, quite a big difference in terms of the phosphate recommendations that would be needed in order to make sure these two different soils are brought up to the same status for phosphorus. Okay, and there's a range of other resources available on this website as well, including some detailed information from the Soil Survey Scotland in terms of soil type. Okay, I think that's all I have for now.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was very interesting. And maybe if you just hold on, we've had one comment actually that you might be interested in. The comment is, I use the PSC maps to all my recommendations. Now, I've reduced seedbed to maintenance levels only. I use phosphite seed treatments and also foliar phosphite, but phosphate straight into the plant. All yields until the numbers have increased since doing this, now going into year 3. So interesting comment.
Very positive. Yes, no, that's excellent. That's excellent. That's really good to hear.
Okay, thank you. Well, I will now try sharing my screen. So are we able to see that okay?
That's you, fine, Chris.
Thanks very much. Okay. So I'm just going to try, and we've heard 2 very good talks there, sort of the science behind it, and I'm really just going to try and put some of this into practical terms. We're often asked to do nutrient recommendations for farmers, and so, you know, how do you actually do that based on the existing recommendations? So we've talked about the technical notes. There's a whole range of technical notes on the FAST website, which are fertilizer related. For spring barley, we've got the nitrogen recommendations, TN 731. And as Bill has said, we've got the 4 phosphate and potash recommendations. There's also sulphur recommendations for crops, although I wasn't really going to touch on that too much today. So there are really many factors you need to consider when you're formulating a nutrient budget for growing spring barley. Soil analysis is essential to gauge the P and K levels and perhaps other nutrients as well, and obviously pH. A soil type also has an influence, whether it's a sandy soil or a sandy loam or other mineral affects your recommendations. For spring barley, the market is often low nitrogen malting barley, or it might be feed barley. So these affect your nitrogen recommendations. Previous crop has a huge bearing on how much nitrogen we should be applying, as does winter rainfall. Also predicted yield of grain, whether you're taking the straw off or not. And then there are NVZ or other environmental considerations that you might need to take into account. Manure and slurry applications will have potentially large amounts of N, P, and K. As Ian mentioned, there is a factor relating to the cost of fertilizer divided by the value of the grain, or the break-even ratio, we would tend to call it, which obviously the higher the cost of fertilizer, the lower the value of grain, then the less nitrogen. You cut back a bit on the nitrogen. So this is a copy of our technical note, or a table from our technical note, which is spring barley recommendations. The previous crop groups, which are in the column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 along the top there, show different crops. So group number 1 would be a crop following a previous crop of cereals. Groups 4, 5, and 6 tend to be more into grassland situations. So adjustments are shown in this table for market and yield, as this is explained in the technical note. And I would really urge you to read the whole technical note to get a full understanding of the recommendations. It's difficult to do it in this short period of time. So I'll do some examples. So in this example, we have spring barley grown for malting, following a crop of spring barley. a predicted yield of 6.5 tonnes per hectare. The soil is classed as other mineral soil. So previous crop being spring barley means it's a group 1. So from the table in the technical note, that gives you a starting point of 130 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. The market is malting, low nitrogen, and as we saw from Ian's presentation, we should be reducing the nitrogen in that situation. So we're talking about reducing it by 20 kilos per hectare for malting, so that takes you down to 110. The winter rainfall is not really applicable when you're dealing with a crop following a group 1 crop because there's less residual nitrogen there. And then there's a yield adjustment which may be justified, and that could be an extra 15 kilos per hectare of nitrogen. So that's taking you anywhere between 110 to 125 kilos per hectare of N. Second example I've got here is a spring barley grown for feed, following grass, a 3 to 5 year grass lay, high nitrogen lay or high clover lay. Predicted yield of 5.5 tonnes a hectare. Soils classed as other mineral soil. So the starting point here, this is a group 5. The starting point recommendation is 60 kilos per hectare. It's grown for feed, so we're not interested in trying to go for low nitrogen, so we're not changing that. No yield adjustment. But in this example, we've had a lot of rainfall over the winter, 500 millimeters. So that's reduced the nitrogen in the soil slightly. So we're suggesting an extra 10 kilos a hectare, taking up to 70 kilos per hectare. Okay, so that's really the nitrogen recommendations and sort of how they work. PK recommendations are based really on replacing what you remove, replacing the crop removal of phosphate and potash, and also the soil analysis. So I'm going to do another example. In this example, we've got a soil analysis showing a low phosphorus. We've been on the map that Bill was just showing you there to find out that it's a PSC1 soil. We also have the potassium as a moderate plus. And the following slides will follow through what recommendations really you can make with this analysis. So as Bill said, for cereal-based arable rotations, the target soil P is M- on PSC1 and 2 soils and M+ on PSC3 soils. So we're PSC1 in this example, so we're looking to eventually get to an M moderate minus. This is the table that Bill showed you. So we've got a low soil P status. We've got a PSC of 1. So that means we're talking about an extra 20 kilos per hectare of phosphorus above the standard rates. From the soil sample, the potash was moderate plus, and this table shows the potash recommendations. So in terms of adjusting your recommendations, we're not talking about putting any extra potash on where you've got a moderate plus situation. This table does show you that if you were in a high, you would reduce your potash recommendations by that amount, or very low, increase them by that amount. So bringing all this together, really, this example is based on a crop of spring barley giving a predicted yield of 6.5 tonnes per hectare, and using the soil results from the earlier slides showing a low phosphate and moderate plus potash. So the yield offtake of phosphate at 6.5 tonnes per hectare is 55 kilos per hectare. So that's how much phosphate's coming out of the crop, the grain and straw. And a low P soil status adds another 20 kilos on the recommendation. So we've got a final recommendation there of 75 kilos per hectare of phosphate. The yield offtake on potash is higher. It's 12 kilos per tonne, so 6.5 tonnes, we're talking about 78 kilos. It's moderate plus, so there's no need to increase or reduce the amount of potash going on. So that's giving you a final recommendation there of 78 kilos per hectare of potash. So that's a very quick run through of doing a nutrient budget for spring barley. I will just summarize, I think, the key messages that we've picked up today. Know your soil levels of P and K, and that goes without saying with soil analysis. Check out the Scotland's soils website to find out what your P sorption levels in your soils are. And please make use of all the technical notes available to work out your NPK requirements, and these are available on the FAS website. I will just reiterate Ian's messages that he put up at the end. There they are. I think the next point really is just to move on to any questions. If I can maybe just ask the panel to show themselves again and unmute themselves, and maybe ask Craig too to join us. So we've just move that over. So we've had the question, what are your views on applying phosphate to the seedbed on spring barley on a moderate to high index soils? Bill, do you have any thoughts about
the specific location and even the timing on that status of soil is not as important? Okay, you're on target from what I can see that based on that statement. So it's where it is in there is, for me, less important. Okay, there's always the potential for some sort of yield response potentially, but if you're already on target, it's mainly about making, as I said in my, hopefully I said in my talk, you are always replacing what you're taking off that year. Okay, that's the way that we design these systems, particularly in relation to phosphorus, is that very seldom are you going to get a yield response for phosphorus applied in a year of application. Okay, so the timing or the location of it is less important than the calculated amount and making sure that your soil is on target.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I guess there is some people are keen sometimes to combine drill, put the phosphate down with the seed, and that often gives you a better looking crop. Whether it gives you a higher yield at the end of the day, I don't know if that's the case on a high or moderate P status soil, but that's perhaps where the question's coming from. So I have another question here. Is there any further work being done to look at spring barley fertilizer recommendations where digestate is being used regularly, as we are seeing in Murrayshire? Bill, that might be one for you again. I don't know.
Yeah, I was a part of the work. I was mainly a part of it for grassland, and that was the use of digestates, and that was the work that really underpinned a lot of the advice that came out some time ago now. I don't know if any additional work on that's targeting phosphorus particularly, and there's already a lot of information available about the amount of phosphorus that we can expect to get from digestate, and really that's the crucial part of it. Is we all use the term digestate, but for someone like me who's had the privilege, or if you want to call it that, of actually having to had different samples from across the country, I know that these digestates are not equivalent. Okay, we don't have digestate. Okay, unlike most bagged fertilizers where there's a fairly recognized standard that needs to be applied. If you're going to sell a bag fertilizer, this is what it is. If it contains phosphorus, then we all can reasonably assume that it's going to be in a certain form, and it says on the bag that that's how much is there. I would say that your most important thing is making sure that you're using most up-to-date analysis for the digestate that you're getting. Okay, just to knowing that it's, for example, past 110 isn't sufficient. You really should have an analysis that's specific to that particular processor or that's developing that or that's producing that digestate. And that kind of information is much more important than anything else that could be any other work that could be related to, you know, how available it is. We do have some very good, there's a couple of technical notes on that give a pretty good description. And I'd say that the numbers that have been generated in that in terms of how much you can assume is available in the year of, or the, again, with phosphorus, there's no method to sort of bypass the importance of ensuring that particularly for sensitive crops across the rotation that you're already on target for phosphorus. Okay, but that it's assuming how much is available as a fertilizer equivalent in the year of application, and we do have quite a bit of information in the technical notes on that, but I don't know of any current work right now.
Thank you, Bill. We are just having another comment about the phosphate in the seed beds. Is there not an argument for a low rate of water-soluble phosphate, even on high-index soils, especially in cold seed beds?
I would need to see it. I'd need to see the yield response for that to be the case. Okay, again, most of what I've seen in the past for that approach is been on low conditions where the soil test results have shown that it's low, and there may be a yield response to it. But again, the benefits attributed to ensuring you're on target or knowing that you're on target, particularly for crops that are sensitive in the rotation, is substantially more important than that approach to this as well. So if I haven't yet seen the information that can document that as being to adopt it as a standard fertilizer recommendation.
Thank you, Bill. Ian, we have a question really about nitrogen rates. We're talking about reducing nitrogen rate by 31 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, was it? To reduce the grain nitrogen percentage by 0.1%.
Yeah.
Does it work the other way around? If you increase the nitrogen rate, would you expect to get a higher nitrogen by 0.1%?
Yes, I mean, we need to, I need to look at the data again to answer that, but yes, it should work in both directions. But we do know there are some site differences as well. So, you know, where you have got, it depends on when the supply is being made, I think. So it can get a little complicated, but it should work in both directions. We have found with spring barley, when we put fertilizer on at anthesis, that we can increase grain nitrogen, and this was part of a study that was just looking at the physiology of uptake. So we know that crops will respond to additional fertilizer, and and you get a steady increase. If you put 40 kilos on, or if you put 80 kilos on, you get a bigger increase with 80 kilos. So it will work in both directions. But of course, there'll be other factors that vary the absolute numbers, as I showed you the range. But it should work until you reach a point at which the grain then starts to saturate. And I think we have evidence that you can actually saturate the grain with it reaches a ceiling, and then any further nitrogen you put on at that point will then find its way and stay in the stem.
Thank you, Ian. Any further questions from anyone? If not, I would just like to thank our speakers, Ian and Bill, and Craig in the background, for 2 really good talks. So if there are no further questions, thank you very much for attending. Hope you found the event worthwhile, and have a good day.